Hi, welcome to another edition of the Family Renewal podcast. I'm Israel Wayne, and we have Hal Melanie Young here today to discuss an aspect of parenting that I've never covered on the podcast, and that is the challenges and delights of raising tweeners. And the tweener years, I think, are kind of being expanded a little bit for sociologists and psychologists because a lot of children are being pressured into maturity much faster these days, but also because you have situations and scenarios where some people are kind of developmentally delayed or have a scenario where they are not pushed into more responsibility faster. So you have tweener dynamics that probably can cover anywhere from about 8 years old to 15 years old. But I think we're going to try to aim for sort of discussing that 11, 12, 13 range, somewhere in there, and the difficulties and the blessings of that age of parenting. So welcome, Hal and Melanie. You guys are authors and conference speakers. You are in North Carolina right now, which is rare for you because usually you're out on the road speaking at conferences this time of year. But at the time this is being recorded, COVID-19 is still going on. It probably will be a different scenario by the time this airs. But welcome to the Family Renewal podcast.
Oh, thanks, Israel. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are glad to be here.
All right. So now, first of all, I guess I'd like you to introduce your family to the listeners. I would assume that most of my listeners are familiar with you, but that there's always that odd dynamic of people only know what they know. And I'm always surprised sometimes that people may have been with me who've never heard of you. So why don't you tell us about your family, your children's genders and ages, and help us to get a bit of a context for your experience so far in parenting?
Well, we have a total of 8 children.
6 boys in a row came first, and then 2 girls after that. Our 6 boys are all adults, still have 3 kids at home.
Right.
And our oldest is 30, and our youngest is right there in that tween age.
So we've been through this, we've been a few times around the track through this age and feel like, okay, we've gotten to test it and no more theories. We are experienced.
That's right. So here's one question I want to throw at you. Do you think it's different for teens and tweeners growing up in this age compared to when you guys were growing up at that age? Are there different challenges that they face, different cultural dynamics and scenarios, or do you feel like it's pretty similar?
Well, the biological things are similar because everybody has to go through that transition from a little child to an adult. And that first couple of years of puberty are when we get all the crazy hormones. We like to say they climb on a hormonal roller coaster, an emotional roller coaster, and invite you to join them.
That's right.
Don't get on that ride. But all of that is normal. It is happening earlier than ever before. It may be environmental issues, we're not sure, but some girls are going through it as early as 8, some boys as early as 9, but depending on the ethnic group and the environment, some as late as 15 or 16. And so it is happening earlier. There are more challenges. Some people are letting kids on social media in the tweens, which is a horrible idea, and that's causing the social anxiety and the social awkwardness of the tweens to be even worse.
Well, I think, related thing, I mean, what we've seen with our older students, and their experience once they got out of the home and at college or working is that behaviorally, there's some arrested development out there in the new generation, and feeling like one psychologist I read said that 25 is the new 15. Now that's a few years ahead of where we're talking about, but his point was adolescence as a developmental stage seems to have have just exploded and lengthened out infinitely. And so, some of the things that you're dealing with your 10, 11, 12-year-old may be something that lingers if you don't deal with it now.
Yeah.
And so the biological stuff happens on its own timetable, but the parenting, the culture, the socialization and such, that can have a much longer reach if you're not careful.
Okay, so you mentioned social media. You said you think it's not a good idea to have tweeners engaged in social media. What have been some guidelines that you've set up for your family as far as introducing social media to your children?
We like to wait until they're 15 or 16 so that we like to have that time to prepare them to use it like a Christian before they leave home.
Hmm.
But the idea of doing it in the preteen years is terrible because
No.
the part of their brain that governs executive functions, like, is this a good idea, bad idea?
Well,
Attention, focus,
judgment,
judgment.
common sense. I mean, that part,
Yeah, it literally
yeah,
unravels during this time.
right.
And it reforms later into the adult version, but you don't ask a kid whose brain is mush to make decisions like they need to make on social media.
Yeah. And you know, we like to look past the immediate horizon to say, okay, what's coming up? What's our long-term goal? And realizing that it's just expected that that a young adult particularly, should be able to understand and be comfortable using social media. That is just part of, it's like being able to use the telephone in previous generations. So we want to have the opportunity to teach our growing adults how to use this in a discerning, Christ-honoring fashion while they're still at home, and we can casually look over their shoulder and saying, you know, that could be misinterpreted. Let's talk about how you express that in a clearer fashion. You know, we can give them that training, just like teaching them to drive.
But they're not ready for it in the tween years.
They're not ready for it when they're 12 or 13, that's for sure.
Yeah, the tween years have enough challenges without adding all that in.
Yeah.
I find that a lot of young people in that age group, it's just expected of them that they will have a smartphone, and they, you know, obviously are quite adept at spending their life on their smartphone. This kind of ties in a bit with social media, but what is your take on responsible use of cell phone / smartphone? Is there a reason for a tweener to have a phone of any kind? Is there a benefit to them having a smartphone? What are your thoughts on that?
In most cases, no.
We long set a policy in our family that we would get kids a cell phone when they got their driver's license. You know, basically when they had the independence to leave the house and go someplace and might need to get directions, might need to call for help, whatever. You know, prior to that, we had a cell phone that rotated among the younger kids. So if they were on a field trip, that was the children's phone or whatever. But, you know, nowadays, pretty much the smartphone is sort of the platform of choice. If you're going to have a cell phone, you might as well have that. But, you know, it's not something, again, that we want to put in the hands of an 11 or 12-year-old. That's just not, it's not healthy for them developmentally.
It's not. And really, during the preteen years, and I know it's hard, I've got one in that age, and all of her older siblings are engaged in social, they're much older than she is, so they're engaged in social media, they're engaged in various uses of the internet, and she wants to be there, so it's a constant battle. But developmentally, they don't need it. They need limited screen time for productive things to produce, not as much screen time to consume.
Yeah. So then, is there some sort of transitional phase or stage where you utilize screen time and maybe responsibility with screen time as a preparation for them having greater access to social media and to smartphones and all that kind of thing? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, for us, the transition time is the preteens into the mid-teens, where they're having more access. They're able to borrow a sibling or a parent's computer, use the family iPad with accountability software on everything. At first, they've got somebody next to them, you know, helping them out, directing them. As they get older, they're given more independence. If they blow it, that independence is taken away. You know, it's a mentoring, a discipleship process. You know, we want our kids to be able to use all these things like a believer. And it's been pretty amazing to see how they do that after they've left home. But all of that needs to be pretty severely limited in the preteens.
What do you do if you find that you have a child that seems to have an addictive personality? There are some students who maybe they play a game on a computer for 30 minutes and then they can walk away and be fine with it. There's others that if they're given a 30-minute limit and they have to come away from it, they just can't handle it and they melt down. And do you handle students or children differently if they seem to have more of a propensity towards really getting sucked into the addictive side of media, or do you just sort of set parameters that, these are our guidelines, these guidelines? What are your thoughts on that?
I think nearly all preteens have an addictive aspect to their personality. It's part of the changes that their brains are going through. We talk about how normal it is for preteens to have obsessions.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be obsessed about horses or about dinosaurs or about military actions or whatever, but they tend to have obsessions. Now you can use that. You can use that in school to use those obsessions to incentivize what they're doing in school, because school tends to be a big problem in the preteens.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of giving them the lame assignment that your grammar program suggested, you can say, well, instead of writing about your 3 favorite foods, why don't you, my son who's obsessed with raptors, why don't you tell me about your 3 favorite raptors and why they're your favorite raptors? And so you can use those obsessions to incentivize things.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about discipline. Obviously, when they're young, a discipline in some ways is easier because they're small and they understand that if the parent has authority in the home, they understand that I'm the child and as a parent, I kind of have to do what is expected of me. But when they get to be 13, 14 years old, sometimes they can be as big as us and as parents. And so there's a sense in which, you can't continue to parent with control anymore in the same way that you did when they were 2. What does the transition look like as you are dealing with all these hormones, sometimes bad attitudes, back talking, this desire that they have for independence, and they're pushing back on the parent's authority? How do you negotiate that? How do you deal with that? Because you still want to be the parent, you still want to have the authority, but you also know you can't just, come down hard on them all the time. How do you handle that transition?
Well, you used a word there. Let's specify. When you say negotiate, I don't mean like, please let me discipline you, but I would say, how do you steer through this obstacle course?
I should have said navigate.
I think, I think that's what you meant. Well, I think there's a really important thing you have to recognize that, when you're looking at the smaller children, the younger children, the scriptures are very clear. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. I mean, that's cut and dried. It's very simple. But you know what? When they're 20, I want them to be listening to the Holy Spirit. I want them to be consulting with wise counselors. I want them to be able to start to make their own decisions and to reason through things. And so this transitional period, starting right now when they're preteens, they're not going to be as responsive to the control and correction type of discipline anyway.
No, in fact, if you try, what you'll get is World War III.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we have an altercation with a preteen.
Mm-hmm.
Son, you're not going to talk to me that way.
It's true.
You are not. Listen, you're not going to the homeschool group this afternoon.
I didn't want to go anyway.
Well, then you're no devices this week.
Well, usually I get too much screen time anyway. That was going to happen.
Well, you're not going to go to the church activity this weekend then.
I don't have any friends at church. It's all dumb, and everybody there is dumb, and they play dumb games in youth group, and I just don't like it. It's a waste of my time.
Well, you're grounded for a month.
I don't care if you ground me for the rest of my life. My life is terrible. It's ruined. You've killed it, and I just don't like it anymore.
And pretty soon you've grounded them for 40 years, and you can't make that stick.
No, but
they're irrational.
But
and the young child that you say, meet me in the laundry room, and you deal with it, and it's over in 10 minutes, you don't have that anymore.
No, and see, the thing of it is, when they are ready to leave your home, you want them to be able to think things through. Why do we do this? It's one thing when the Bible says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, that's easy. That's simple. There's no discussion. There's no reasoning required on that. But there's so many decisions and so many issues that come up where they need to be able to think this through, to apply the scriptures they know, to ask questions to the right people, to understand that there's a reason for these things, and to make those reasons their own, or else to come up with their own reasons either way. But you can't just do it because mom and dad said so or didn't.
So how do you get there without letting them get away with disrespect and sin? Because you can't let them do that. You have to discipline sin.
Mm.
Well, you have to kind of change the order of the way you do things. With a small child, you discipline, then you talk. If you try talking before you discipline with a small child, you're going to lose it.
Yes.
With a small child. Right. With a preteen and older, you need to listen before you discipline. And you need to talk before you discipline. And that's time consuming and it's annoying. But when you invest in the relationship, because see, the enemy is telling them, because there's craziness in their hormones, the enemy is telling them, nobody understands you, nobody cares about you. And when you say, whoa, honey, look, let's sit down and tell me what's going on here. I love you and I want to understand.
That's really defusing the whole thing right there, when you're contradicting the narrative that they're hearing in their, let's face it, their fallen and sinful hearts. They're telling them they don't love you, they don't care, they don't understand. When you show them, yes, I do love you and I'm trying to understand, that kind of, that takes them a little bit off their feet and kind of disarms it a bit to say, okay, well, explain this to me. And then you can interact and say, now, this is where you're wrong. Maybe we were wrong with something and I need to seek your forgiveness for that.
But the word of God says this, and you were very disrespectful to me and I'm going to have to discipline that. And we've often at that point had kids say, you're right, Mom. What are we going to do? What?
Yeah, wow. Mind blown.
Yes.
But they do, because
you invest in the relationship first.
And you are showing them that you're not just the big mean person who rules their lives, but that you have a purpose in the decisions you make, that there's reasons behind the rules that you've established, and that, the best thing too is when you show that you are subject to God's rule, just like you expect them to be subject.
So that's a very long answer to your question.
It's a very thorough answer, and I appreciate that, because I think every parent who has a young person in that demographic struggles with knowing how to navigate that. They struggle with knowing how to approach those relationships, and so many times parents will stoop to the level of their teenager and sort of duke it out with them on their terms.
It's hard not to.
It's hard not to. They'll suck you into it, won't they? Yes. That usually doesn't go well. Now, you mentioned the hormones, and you mentioned that that's something that often plays a part in here, and that they are sometimes irrational. They don't necessarily know why they feel the way they do, but they have these strong feelings that are, sometimes all over the map. But with that, the changes that happen biologically in puberty, now all of a sudden there's a new sexual interest. There's a new interest in the other gender. They're trying to discover and learn about their own bodies. What are some guidelines, or what's a template for us in terms of helping to establish patterns and principles of purity without, resorting to some sort of, weird, puritanical. I don't want to say that because I think that casts shade at the Puritans. I don't mean to do that.
I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm saying? Some kind of prudishness. That's a good place.
Well, one of the things I think is really important is that the talk is something that's really more like the conversation. It's something that you should have been talking about since they were little kids in the bathtub,
Yeah, that you can't just wait till some magical age and then throw all this out there, that you start building relationship and talking about these things very early. In fact, you've got to in our current culture, because the average age of exposure to porn is now less than 11. And when we first started speaking about this, we've written a book about sexuality for teenage guys. When we first started speaking about this, people would say, oh, my 16-year-old has found some bad stuff online. Now it's 7 to 9-year-olds.
And, the way that it's structured now online, it's coming looking for you. You have to actively. You don't have to be a bad kid. It's not a matter of I have to sneak out and find it. It's a matter of I have to actively avoid it. And our kids are stumbling into things that they didn't intend to.
And they're finding things in places we parents never dreamed.
Right.
They're being exposed by their 10-year-old neighbor, by their 8-year-old cousin, and by a kid with a phone in his pocket at church. And so we need to very early express safety issues about sexuality with our kids.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what people are not allowed to see and do and touch, and what they're not allowed to see and do and touch, and what to do if people do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And we also need to be sharing everything we share about sexuality in biblical context.
Mm-hmm.
That we need to be very frank with our preteens about sexuality. Their friends are watching perversions in video online.
Well, we live in
and so we need to be very frank with them, but always in the context of biblical sexuality, that God created this for marriage, and it's a good thing within marriage, and outside of marriage it's sin. You know, and I think if we keep bringing things back to the biblical context, because I think where people have gotten in trouble with the prudishness is that they try to say that all sexuality is bad, and it's not.
Well, they take a good thing and they try to make it off limits and bad in some respects, so that there's guilt attached to it, when really you need to say, no, let's give this the biblical balance and say, this is a good thing
within marriage,
within the guardrails that God's put around it. Okay. And if we just keep bringing it back to that, I think that goes a long way.
And any sexuality outside of God's guardrails is sinful and bad and harmful.
Right.
So on a practical level, what are some resources that you found in terms of internet security, accountability software, filtering software, that kind of thing? Do you feel at liberty to mention specific software or programs or things that you found that are helpful?
Sure. Mm-hmm. We've used Covenant Eyes for many, many years for our family, and it has gotten better and solved some of the problems it's had in the past. It's gotten better and better. It's now using an AI portion of the program that can even identify what's shown on the screen. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to have any kind of description or something, and that gets around a lot of the ways that people try to get around it.
Yeah. And I think it's important to realize that these programs are meant to be tools. They're not solutions. You know, that if you've got filtering or blocking on there, there's ways around it. Things are going to leak out and people are going to find a way to circumvent it. So, you know, you have to say, okay, this is to help me supervise what my young people are doing, and for us grown-ups to provide me with the accountability that I need, you know.
That we all need.
And that's an important point too. I think that any of these programs, you need to make it something that's universal, because guess what? Grown-ups get tempted as well as kids. And we can get into just as bad or sometimes worse problems than our kids can. So
which can make it a lot harder to help your kids when they know that a parent is dealing with the same sin. You're going to have a hard time keeping your kids out of trouble.
Or if you're overwhelmed with your personal guilt and feel like I can't say anything to my kids because I've got the same problem. No, you go back to scripture. You always go back to say, you know what? The Bible tells us don't go in this direction. And we're all going to follow the biblical path here. Mom, dad, all of the kids. That's our one rule.
Talking about this, Israel, we have a free resource pack about teaching your kids about Christian sexuality. And if folks want to go to raisingrealmen.com/Christian sexuality, it's a free resource pack that will direct them to several online accountability programs, tips how to know if your child is engaging in this stuff and hiding it from you. Lots of helpful stuff there.
Excellent. Well, as we close here, why don't you tell people just about some of the resources that you've published? You have your own publishing company. What's the name of your publishing company? It's
Great Waters Press. And we have the book on tweens is called No Longer Little, Parenting Tweens with Grace and Hope.
Yes.
And that's really what we need a lot of that. Resource that we mentioned for on sexuality for teenage guys is a book called Love, Honor, and Virtue.
Yes.
Okay. And it's written for the young guys, so it's very direct.
It's short.
It's very short, but it puts
sexuality
everything
from a biblical perspective.
From a biblical standpoint.
And it engages what our world is dealing with right now. We're best known for our book, Raising Real Men. And we are becoming better known for our subscription box, Craftsman Crate, which teaches artisanal skills and has everything you need in the box.
You also have a great book on marriage.
My beloved and my friend, How to Be Married to Your Best Friend Without Changing Spouses.
Yes.
And how are some that people can connect with you, either through your website or through social media?
Sure.
The easiest way is Raising Real Men RaisingRealMen.com is our main website.
And we are everywhere on social media at Raising Real Men.
That's our handle all over the place. So.
Very good. Well, I encourage people to check you out. You guys have a podcast as well?
We do. You can. It's called Making Biblical Family Life Practical, and you can find it at halandmelanie.com/radio.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for taking time to join us. I'm sure that we'll have you back on the podcast in the future. You have an enormous amount of resources that are helpful to families. And for those who have not checked out your website before, I hope they will sign up on your email list. And then for those who have, make sure you go back and check out the new resources, because there are new resources being added all the time, things that will be helping you and your family. So thank you guys. Appreciate you joining me.
Thank you, Ezra.
Thank you.